Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The name isn't shouted in the streets or trending on social media, but if you say it in a quiet room, something happens. There's this sense of gravity, not the kind that pulls you down, but the kind that calls you deeper. And the more you learn about the man, the less you can ignore him. He gets under your skin, not with noise, but with silence, with conviction, with that steady, unwavering commitment to what's right, even when everything around you is wrong. He wasn't just a theologian. He wasn't just a thinker. Calling him that would be like calling fire warm. It's true, but it's not enough. Because Bonhoeffer didn't live in the abstract. He lived in the fire, in tension, in the unbearable space between knowing what should be done and actually doing it. And he paid for that. With everything. The way he saw life. It wasn't just philosophical. It was deeply embodied. It asked something from him. From everyone, actually. And not something small, not something vague or poetic. It asked for everything. Your comfort, your reputation, your safety, and maybe even your life. But here's what's wild. The more you lean into that kind of life, the freer you become. That's the paradox. That's the mystery. That's what makes his theory of life feel like it's made of bone and flame. He saw the world slipping. Germany wasn't just changing politically, it was unraveling morally. And most people, including the church, were quiet. Some were even complicit. But Bonhoeffer wasn't interested in preserving appearances. He wasn't interested in saving his own skin. He was interested in truth, and that made him dangerous. He understood that values, real values, only mean something when they cost you something. It's easy to believe in courage until courage threatens your job, your family, your freedom. Then you find out what you actually believe. And this is what set him apart. He didn't flinch when the cost came. He didn't flinch when his colleagues rationalized their inaction. He didn't flinch when silence would have been so much easier. He just stayed the course, quiet, director, relentless. Now, that phrase, costly grace, has become kind of iconic. But when you really sit with it, it cuts. Because it's not the soft, feel-good grace we're used to hearing about. It's not the everything's fine, don't worry about it version. It's not grace as a loophole. It's grace as a summons, a demand, a revolution. It says, you are loved, and now you must change. And if that doesn't hit you in the gut, read it again. Because costly grace doesn't coddle you. It calls you out. It refuses to let you stay the same. And yet, it's the most liberating thing in the world. It doesn't care about your image. It cares about your soul. That's what makes it sacred. That's what makes it unbearable to some and irresistible to others. Bonhoeffer saw that cheap grace, grace without transformation, was killing people. Not obviously, not with violence, but quietly. It numbs. It soothes. It tells you that you're okay while you drift further and further from anything true. It replaces conviction with comfort. And that, to him, was the real danger. And you don't have to be religious to feel that, by the way. You don't need a cross around your neck to recognize how seductive mediocrity can be, or how easy it is to become numb, to trade courage for convenience, to stop asking the hard questions because the answers might hurt. That's what Bonhoeffer rebelled against. Not people, not institutions, not even governments at first, but that numbness, that passivity, that sense that we can know what's right and still choose what's easy. He believed that real faith, real integrity was always active, always moving, always costing something, and not in grand, cinematic ways, but in ordinary, terrifying, beautiful ones. Telling the truth when it's unpopular, standing up when everyone else sits down, loving when you're exhausted, saying no when the room expects yes. What makes his life theory so powerful isn't just that he wrote about these things, it's that he lived them. He made choices most of us hope we'll never have to face, but those choices didn't come out of nowhere. They were shaped, slowly, in the day-to-day grind of being someone who refused to look away. He taught that ethics aren't hypothetical. They don't live in ivory towers or classrooms. They live in the gut, in the moment, in the weight of a decision no one else sees. When someone lies and you don't correct them. When someone suffers and you do nothing. When injustice knocks and you pretend you're not home. He believed that how we live, how we really live, is the clearest expression of what we believe. Not what we post, not what we say in interviews, but what we do when the moment comes. That's the measure. Even in prison, that clarity stayed with him, maybe even deepened. You'd think being locked away knowing death was around the corner would crush a person, but for Bonhoeffer it clarified everything. He still wrote, still reflected, still held on to this radical sense of hope. Not because he thought he'd be rescued, but because hope for him wasn't about outcomes. It was about posture, a way of standing in the storm without being swept away. He didn't see freedom as doing whatever you want. He saw it as being bound to truth, to love, to responsibility. That's where life got its meaning, not in detaching from the world, but in engaging it fully, not in escaping suffering, but in bearing it with purpose. He had this quiet courage, the kind that doesn't need to be seen, the kind that doesn't advertise itself. It's not performative, it's not loud, it just doesn't bend. That kind of presence is rare, and when you encounter it, even through his letters, his writings, it stays with you. It confronts your excuses. It softens your cynicism. It asks more of you. You start to realize, maybe life isn't about being safe. Maybe it's about being faithful. Maybe it's not about climbing ladders but planting roots. Maybe it's not about saying the right things, but becoming someone whose life speaks for itself. He talked about life together, about community that wasn't shallow or convenient, a kind of sacred messiness where people are known fully and loved anyway, where they challenge each other, forgive each other, hold each other accountable, not out of control, but out of care. That vision feels almost revolutionary today, but it's deeply human and deeply needed. Even in the final moments of his life, there was no bitterness, just clarity, peace even. Not because he was spared, but because he was anchored. He knew who he was. He knew what he stood for. He knew what mattered. And that's the question we all have to face eventually. What matters? What's worth the risk? What's worth the sacrifice? Who are you when the applause stops? When comfort disappears? When no one is watching? For Bonhoeffer, the answers weren't abstract. They were woven into how he lived, how he loved, how he resisted, how he died. But even more than how he died, it's how he lived that speaks to us now. There's something about integrity that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream. It doesn't sell. But you feel it when it's there. And more importantly, you notice when it's gone. Bonhoeffer had that integrity, not in some polished, saintly way, but in the quiet way of someone who refused to split his life into compartments. He didn't put truth in one box and comfort in another. For him, it was all or nothing. And yet, there's no sense that he thought himself above others. He didn't live like a preacher on a pedestal. He struggled, he doubted, he wrestled with guilt, with frustration, with fear. But he still showed up. He still chose to act when acting was dangerous. And maybe that's what makes his life so relatable. It wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, it was honest. He once said, "Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act." That line alone carries enough weight to sit with for a lifetime. Think about how many times we stay quiet. Not because we agree, but because it's easier. Because we tell ourselves it's not our fight. Because we hope someone else will do it first. But Bonhoeffer knew that neutrality is not neutral. That comfort can become complicity. That silence in the wrong moments isn't peace, it's betrayal. He didn't set out to be a hero. In fact, he hated the idea of being turned into one. He believed in the complexity of every person, including himself. And maybe that's why his legacy feels so different. He never made himself the center. He always pointed back to something larger, to a sense of justice, of divine love, of unshakable truth that exists, whether we like it or not. And that truth for him was personal. It wasn't a weapon to be used against others. It wasn't a badge of superiority. It was a calling, a burden, a light, and it demanded everything. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with that level of clarity. When you see something that others don't or won't, it can isolate you, especially when you refuse to play along, when you won't lie, won't flatter, won't nod, just to keep the peace. Bonhoeffer walked into that loneliness willingly, not out of pride but out of conscience. And yet he never closed his heart. He still wrote about community, about music, about friendship, even in solitary confinement. Even as the end crept closer, he never became bitter. That's what's so astonishing. There's no trace of cynicism in his final letters, just love and strength and an unwavering belief that living truthfully, even if it leads to death, is better than surviving in denial. It wasn't martyrdom for its own sake. He didn't seek death, but he also didn't run from it when it came. Because in the end, what he feared more than dying was becoming a man who betrayed his deepest convictions. He understood something most people avoid their whole lives, that the soul has a memory. And when you violate it, even if no one sees, you carry the weight. So many people today live split, one face for the world, another for their reflection. But Bonhoeffer chose alignment between belief and behavior, between values and action, between truth and presence. And it cost him everything, but it also gave him something indestructible. His words still cut through noise like a blade, not because they're clever, but because they're clean, simple, undeniable. "Who stands fast?" he asked. "Only the one whose final standard is not reason, not principles, not conscience, not freedom, not virtue, but readiness to sacrifice all these when called to obedience and faith." Let that sink in. We live in a time obsessed with being right, with holding the moral high ground. But Bonhoeffer knew that real moral courage is not about being right, it's about being faithful. And sometimes, that means standing in the dark, unsure of the outcome, but certain of the path. He was part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. Think about the gravity of that. A man of peace, a theologian, a pacifist. And yet, he reached a point where inaction felt more evil than resistance, where obedience to love required a break from legalism, where integrity demanded risk. And that's what makes his theory of life feel alive even now. It's not about checking boxes, it's about paying attention, listening, discerning, and then acting, no matter the cost. His freedom wasn't found in avoiding danger. It was in knowing that when he stood before God, he would have no excuses, that he hadn't played it safe while others suffered, that he hadn't built a life on comfort while the world burned. That kind of inner clarity is rare, but it's not impossible. It doesn't require sainthood, it requires honesty, courage, presence, and it begins in the small things, the daily choices, the uncomfortable conversations, the moments when no one is watching. That's where Bonhoeffer's theory becomes a mirror. It reflects you back to yourself. Are you living what you believe? Or are you performing what looks good? Are you telling yourself the truth? Or just rehearsing the same safe story? Bonhoeffer's life invites us into a deeper kind of existence, one that doesn't chase applause, one that doesn't flinch in the face of discomfort, one that refuses to trade integrity for approval. He reminds us that truth is not fragile, but our relationship with it can be, and that the cost of living truthfully may be high, but the cost of not doing so is higher. It's strange how someone who died so young, just 39, can feel so timeless. But maybe that's what truth does. It transcends the moment. It echoes, not because it's loud, but because it's rooted. Bonhoeffer wasn't trying to shape history. He was just trying to be faithful in his time. And yet here we are, still listening, still learning from the way he carried himself. There's a part of us that wants to believe life is clean, that the good are always rewarded and the wicked exposed. But Bonhoeffer knew the world didn't work that way. That's why he didn't wait for fairness to act. He chose to live rightly even when the ending wasn't going to be a happy one, even when the outcome didn't make sense, even when the system was broken and rigged. He had this unshakable understanding that obedience is not obedience if it depends on the result. If we only do the right thing when it pays off, we're not actually choosing virtue, we're negotiating. And negotiation is what got the world into chaos in the first place. The compromise, the delay, the people who said, not yet, not now, maybe later. But Bonhoeffer had no patience for later. When injustice comes knocking, later becomes surrender in slow motion. He once described ethics as responsibility for others, not ideas, not appearances, but people. And that's what drove him. Not dogma, not ego, not the desire to be remembered, but the aching reality that people were suffering, and that suffering demands a response. We've grown up in a culture that rewards the safe choice, the easy win, the surface solution. We're told to protect ourselves, build our brands, curate our lives. But Bonhoeffer points to something deeper, something quieter, something heavier. He calls us to build not a brand, but a soul, and that requires choices no algorithm can make for you. He knew something about fear too, the kind that creeps in when you speak out, when you stand alone, when you realize that the cost is not theoretical, it's real. And yet, the fear didn't stop him. It walked with him, and he kept going anyway. That's what real courage looks like. It's not the absence of fear. It's moving forward in spite of it. It's choosing to show up even when your voice shakes. It's choosing to love when the risk of loss is high. Choosing to act when the outcome is uncertain. That's what he did. And that's what he calls us to do. His letters from prison, they're not bitter. They're not preachy. They're intimate, reflective. They ask questions that most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. What does it mean to live well? What's worth giving your life for? What's the point of freedom if you don't use it for something greater than yourself? And maybe the most powerful thing about those writings is how much they're filled with others. He didn't just write about himself, he wrote about his fiancée, about his family, about his friends, about God, about people he'd never meet but still cared for. Even in confinement, his heart was open. That says a lot, because pain often shrinks us, makes us small, makes us defensive. But Bonhoeffer stayed expansive. He didn't shut down, he turned outward. And that kind of love, that vulnerable, fearless love, is rare. He believed that to follow truth you had to become deeply human, not perfect, not invincible, but honest and available and connected. His theory of life was never about escape. It was about incarnation, about showing up in the real world with all its mess and refusing to flinch. He once said that we must learn to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the suffering, the excluded, the powerless. That's not just theology, that's vision. That's moral clarity. That's choosing empathy over indifference, presence over prestige. And if we're honest, it's the opposite of how most of us are trained to think. We're told to climb, to get ahead, to win. But Bonhoeffer asks us to descend, to serve, to listen, to lift others up even if it means lowering ourselves. That doesn't mean becoming passive. He was anything but passive. It means rooting your strength in something real, not in dominance but in sacrifice, not in visibility but in value. And here's the haunting thing. The more we build lives around avoiding pain, the less alive we become. We think security is the goal, but security without purpose is just a soft prison. Bonhoeffer understood that. He knew the real risk wasn't dying. It was living a lie. That kind of clarity doesn't come overnight. It's cultivated through reflection, through tension, through listening when you'd rather escape, through choosing to ask the hard questions again and again until they become part of you. And when you do that, when you really do that, you begin to sense something shifting. Your life gets quieter, but denser, richer, more grounded. You begin to trade surface brilliance for depth, flash for substance, image for presence. You stop asking, "What do people think of me?" and start asking, "What kind of person am I becoming?" You stop needing to be right and start wanting to be true. You stop performing and start living. That's the core of Bonhoeffer's theory of life. It's not a list of principles. It's a transformation of posture, a reorientation toward the real, a willingness to lose what the world values in order to gain what can't be taken away. He called it discipleship, but you could also call it character, or courage, or conscience. Whatever word you use, it all points to the same center, a life that isn't built on appearance, but on truth. And that kind of life, it doesn't need to be famous. It doesn't need to be validated. It doesn't even need to be safe. It just needs to be real. Some people leave behind monuments, statues, streets named after them. Bonhoeffer left behind something else, something quieter but far more enduring. A way of being, a kind of presence that lives not in bronze or stone, but in the conscience of anyone who's ever asked, "How do I live well when the world falls apart?" Because the truth is, the world is always falling apart in some way. Maybe not with tanks in the streets, maybe not with bombs in the sky, but slowly, quietly, ethically, spiritually. And every generation gets tested, not just by what it says, but by what it tolerates, by what it lets slide, by what it excuses for the sake of convenience. Bonhoeffer didn't have time to build a legacy. He barely had time to build a career. But in the short space he had, he built something eternal, a life of radical alignment, a life where belief and behavior were welded together, day by day, no matter the cost. He didn't try to be a savior. He didn't speak in grand declarations, but his life whispered something powerful. That courage is a choice, and it starts long before anyone notices. That resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a letter, a refusal, a quiet stand, a step into danger because stepping back would be betrayal. His final moments weren't broadcast, no cameras, no crowds, just a man walking calmly toward death, surrounded by enemies, fully aware. That silence, that walk, is louder than any speech, because it wasn't defeat, it was fulfillment. He had already died to ego long before his body was taken. That's why he could walk freely. He was already free. And that freedom, it's not just about Bonhoeffer. It's available to anyone, to you, to me, right now. That's the uncomfortable beauty of his life. It removes our excuses. It doesn't shame us, but it does strip us bare. It says, you don't have to be loud or rich or powerful to live with conviction. You just have to be willing to listen, willing to say no when it counts, willing to take responsibility for something outside yourself, willing to live truthfully when the cost is real and no one is clapping. His legacy invites us into a deeper kind of courage, one that isn't reactive, one that doesn't need to be seen, a courage that grows in silence, that holds firm in the gray areas, that doesn't wait for permission to act with integrity. And that's where it gets personal. Because sooner or later we all hit a moment of choice, a quiet moment, no music, no spotlight, just a question. Do I bend or do I stand? It could be small, a conversation, a compromise, a click, a silence. But you'll feel it. That tension in your chest, that voice in your gut, that little moment when you know, this matters. Bonhoeffer's life doesn't give us a script for what to do. It gives us a posture, a presence, a challenge. And if you're listening closely, it doesn't sound like condemnation. It sounds like a calling, not to be him, but to be you. without the mask, to be whole, awake, brave. And maybe that's what the world is most hungry for right now. Not more noise, not more performance, but people who are rooted, who live from a center that doesn't shift with popularity or fear, who do the small things faithfully, who tell the truth, who stay soft but unshakable. Bonhoeffer believed that love and truth weren't opposites, that the most loving thing you can do is stand in truth, and that the most truthful thing you can do is act in love. Those two ideas, when combined, are the most powerful force in the world. And in the end, that's what he lived. He died with peace, not because he was spared, but because he was faithful. His theory of life isn't easy. It doesn't promise success, it doesn't offer shortcuts, but it does give you something rare, a way to walk through this world with your soul intact, a way to face the mirror without flinching, a way to carry yourself when everything else is falling apart, not perfectly, but honestly, and that might be the only thing that lasts.